I call the honourable member Dr. Russell Norman. Tanakwe.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I speak to Rise on behalf of the Green Party about this GCSB bill. It strikes me always strange that it is the parties of the right that want to restrict our freedom. Time and again, what we find is that the parties of the right want to intrude into our lives. They want to listen to our phone calls, they want to read our emails, they want to know what we're looking at on the internet. And here we have in front of us yet another bill from the party of the right, the National Party and the ACT Party, and I guess supported by Peter Dunn, though I hope he changes his mind. Another bill by the parties of the right to restrict our freedom and breach our privacy. Let's remember what this bill does. This bill gives the Prime Minister and the GCSB greater powers to break into our houses, to put bugs into our houses. It gives them greater power to listen to our phone calls without a warrant. It gives them greater power to look at our emails without a warrant. They don't need a warrant. It gives them greater power to monitor every activity that we do every second of every day. That is what a surveillance state is about. And it is striking that it is always parties of the right that support the surveillance state, that oppose freedom and try to breach our privacy year after year after year. And here we have another example of it. The tragedy of it in this occasion is that in the past, the attempts to basically undermine our freedom have been justified by the war of terror or whatever. Then, of course, there was the Red Terror before that. On this occasion, the justification for the expansion of the powers of the GCSB to spy on us even more is in order to cover up the Prime Minister's embarrassment. That is the tragedy of this particular piece of legislation. What stands behind it is because the Prime Minister is embarrassed as the responsible minister who was supposed to be keeping the GCSB acting lawfully and failed. This bill to intrude further into our lives by the spy agencies, its sole purpose, really, or its main purpose, driven politically, is to cover up the political embarrassment of the Prime Minister. And that's a tragedy. Why is it that the parties of the right always support further intrusions onto our freedom and our privacy? I would argue it's because they think they're never going to be the target of it. They think, well, we're conservatives, the security institutions, they don't target us. They'll target those lefties, those greenies, those radicals. They're not going to target us. So we don't care that we give more power to the GCSB to break into our houses, to listen to our phone calls, because we're not going to be the target of it. And maybe they're right. I mean, if you look at the history of the SIS, it was found that it was spying on Aziz Chowdhury, an anti-free trade activist. The SIS persecuted Ahmed Zawi because he was a democracy activist in Algeria and upset the Algerian regime. We know that the GCSB in the Kim.com case was acting on behalf of the US government. The Obama administration, of course, is highly dependent on donations from Hollywood. Hollywood are very upset with Kim.com. And when Hollywood said jump, the Obama administration jumped. When Obama jumped, then the GCSB jumped because the GCSB is part of the Five Eyes network. So we know that the targets for the security agencies tend to be people that parties of the right figure they're never going to be part of. Lefties, progressives, greenies. So what would they care that they breach the freedom and the democratic rights and civil liberties of ordinary New Zealanders? Now, of course, those ordinary New Zealanders that the parties of the right, like the National Party, are happy to breach their freedom and their civil liberties, those ordinary New Zealanders are people like anti-apartheid activists. Now, of course, we have a Prime Minister who can't remember whether he was opposed to apartheid or not. But for those people that were opposed to apartheid, of course the National Party wasn't opposed to apartheid, the Prime Minister just can't remember whether he was or he wasn't opposed to apartheid. But those activists who were opposed to apartheid were the targets of the security agencies. Those people who campaigned against apartheid, they were the very targets of the SIS and the GCSB. And those are the people who, once again, in the future, given these new powers to the GCSB, will once again be the target of these agencies. It's very difficult for us to know what the agencies do. Only very rarely does it become clear what they're up to. The Aziz Chowdhury case is an exception. The Ahmed Zawi case is an exception. The Kim.com case. Mostly we do not know what they do because they operate in secrecy. But when they do, when it is revealed what they do, what we find is their targets are progressives. That's who they've targeted historically. And this is a bill to give them more power. Mr Shearer from the Labor Party made a very valid case for an independent inquiry. I believe not only do we need an inquiry into the illegal activities of the GCSB, an independent inquiry, which there has been none, but we need an inquiry as to what is the role of the security agencies. Remember, these were established during the Cold War. They kind of ran out of steam after the Cold War ended, and then they used the War of Terror as a justification for what they were doing. And now they're trying to find new justifications, cyber attacks are part of it. There is no doubt that cyber attacks are real, no question about it. The question is, what should be the role of these kind of agencies in a free and democratic society, given that they involve fundamental intrusions onto our freedom and civil liberties? That's why we need an independent inquiry that is broader than just the Kim.com case, but is into the role of the agencies themselves. If they are to exist, then we need to know why they exist. We need to know what kind of limitations on our freedom and democracy we're willing to withstand or put up with by the very existence of these agencies. I think this then goes to the issue of oversight. What we know in other jurisdictions is that there is some kind of parliamentary oversight of these agencies. There is no parliamentary oversight of these agencies here. The sole democratic oversight is John Key. John Key, as we've seen, has forgotten his role, amongst many other things. He's forgotten that his job is to protect our freedom and democracy from the intelligence agencies, but he hasn't performed that function. In other jurisdictions, there is democratic oversight. When I've spoken to people that have been involved in the intelligence community over years, what they said was, the thing we always feared in a United States framework was that the Congressional Committee would pull us up and we would be forced to give testimony to the Congressional Intelligence Committee about what we'd done, and if we'd broken the law, we'd be put in jail. There is no parliamentary capacity in the New Zealand system for the Intelligence and Security Committee to force any of the agencies to give testimony. They don't have to say a word to us. We have no ability to force them to tell us what they're doing. I am a member of the Intelligence and Security Committee. We have no capacity to force the intelligence agencies to tell us whether they're acting lawfully or not. We have no capacity to force an intelligence officer to appear in front of the committee and tell us what they're doing. We have no capacity to inquire into it. And if you think about it, the Intelligence and Security Committee is going to have to consider this legislation. It's a bit like the Social Services Committee was having to consider legislation about work and income, but it wasn't allowed to ask any questions about how WINS operates. It wasn't allowed to ask how the unemployment benefit is administered or any of the other benefit system. It had to decide whether the legislation was good legislation or bad legislation without knowing or being allowed to ask a single thing about how WINS operates. The Intelligence and Security Committee that considers this legislation will have to make a decision about whether it supports the legislation or not without ever being allowed to ask a single question about how the intelligence community actually works in New Zealand. Because under the statute that it's established, we don't have the right to do that. That is the level, the woeful level of parliamentary oversight of the intelligence and security services in New Zealand. Is it any wonder that these agencies living under a stone for 3 or 4 decades with no public scrutiny, no sunlight ever exposed to them, went dysfunctional? Are any of us really surprised that a group of a few hundred people who never had any oversight? The Inspector General of Intelligence and Security was a joke. There was never any oversight of what they did. They lived under a rock, they did what they liked. And so at the end of it, we found they were highly dysfunctional. That's what the Kitteridge report showed. Just in pure bureaucratic efficiency terms, highly dysfunctional. We found they were operating unlawfully. Is anyone surprised when there is no proper oversight of these agencies? This bill does not put in place proper oversight of these agencies. There is still no democratic oversight. The Inspector General of Intelligence and Security should be an officer of Parliament. The IGIS should report to Parliament as the Auditor General does, or the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment does, or the Ombudsman does. That should be the role of oversight. The Intelligence and Security Committee should be a committee of Parliament which has the right to require the intelligence agencies to appear before it and the right to force information out of them. We do not have that right. So in the absence of an independent inquiry, in the absence of any parliamentary oversight, given the record of the intelligence communities to target progressive activists, it is obscene that the parties of the right once again want to restrict our freedoms, want to breach our privacy, want to break into our houses, want to give these intelligence agencies all these expanded powers. We cannot support this bill, Mr. Speaker.
I call the honourable member Jonathan Young.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very pleased to stand and speak on the GCSB in relation